And here we go. Hello, YouTube, and hello, everyone, and welcome to what I think is the fourth session of this school. To recap on what we've done this far, we had two lectures from Cameron on transition design, and last week we started sharing our experiments with the tools and approaches and methodologies that he has introduced to us. Today, we are going to have three different projects presented. Each of them is going to have a bit more time. For those of us who are not Cameron, you can leave your comments here or in the dedicated board on Miro so that there is a bit more of an interactive feedback. And there will be roughly 20-25 minutes per project. We will try and go with the flow. If it's a bit shorter, that's fine. If it ends up being a bit up to that time, then I'm going to moderate on time. So, without any further ado, I'd like to ask Marina to get going with the presentation, unless I forgot something. Damien, did I forget anything? Good. Marina, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I hope this will be interesting. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Where do I go? Oh, sorry. Yeah. The screen. Okay. So, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see, well, how this kind of classes are helping me to move forward with my project. But before that, I just wanted to give a little bit of context of what the project is about for those who are not familiar with it, although I think you probably all are. But this project is based on my neighborhood, which is the Beauvoir, this place here, which is on the border between Hackney and Islington here in London. And when I started the project, I was interested in kind of promoting more engagement between neighbors. And I started kind of very broadly looking at the built environment and understanding that there is a bit of a divide that it is created, it's very visible for this built environment between the kind of the more affluent part of the neighborhood and the council block. But I was also looking at how much assets we have, and how engaged this community is already. And they throw like lots of different parties. So that was like a barbecue for the coronation of the king, and we have the Women's Institute. We have these gatherings at the church, which I'm volunteering at, which is every Wednesday. We have the summer party with dog show and everything, and kind of Christmas fairs. And so it's like a very, very proactive community, and they're very organized. And for a moment, I was a bit like, okay, so, and now what? Like we have all of this, we have, and what does that have to do with with service design in a way? And so I started kind of interviewing people and residents to understand how they experience the neighborhood, and a lot of these kind of common themes starting to pop up. So this divide was something that people weren't happy about it. A lot of people thought that maybe there should be more ways to integrate. There was also a lot going on about loneliness and the elderly. Good things and bad things about communication channels. So we have some really good communication channels, but between residents, but not very good ones to speak to the council, and so forth and so on. So there was like these themes kind of coming up, and they are all somehow related to each other. And I kept thinking, okay, so how do I move on? Where is going to be kind of my access point to start doing something with the community to promote more engagement between the neighbors. And I went to the Beyond Sticky Notes book because I had done all of these interviews, and I kind of, summertime was arriving, and I just sent an invite for a workshop without having any plan on what I was going to do on the workshop. So I started freaking out a bit and thinking, okay, what do I do? What do I do? And I went to read Beyond Sticky Notes, and I think a lot of kind of the transition design to my project is coming through that. And the first step was kind of to actually put the question out to the people, you know, where should we begin, and make the workshop about having this conversation to understand where people thought that they had more energy to work. And so I called people in, and I think the first thing was like this kind of question that I had on the table, where I was asking people what could and should we work towards as a neighborhood. And I feel that that was kind of a first step to understand how co-design could work in this way that Kellyanne puts in the book. And from what I understand, like, and for me that was helpful, was to understand this distinction that she makes between the traditional co-design process and what the transformational co-design process that she also mentioned. So I think that's something that like we've been taught at UAOL, but I thought it was nice to kind of reiterate that, you know, when we're doing a design process. So what she says in the book is that pretty much like on the traditional co-design process, you're mainly focused on the output. But then when you are doing a transformational co-design process, you kind of understand that you have an output that is kind of the service or product, which is kind of a bit more tangible in a way. But you also have a social outcome, which is kind of a shift in the relationships between the people who live the experience, communities, and professionals. So I think that's going again around decision making and power and influence. So for me, it was very interesting to kind of suddenly separate those two parts. But then I kind of kept wondering that actually on the traditional co-design, you also have the social outcome, but it feels that the social outcome on this traditional co-design process is kind of reaffirmative of the status quo. So that kind of made me wonder a bit of like, first, the transformational co-design reminds us the power of the design process to shift social dynamics. But also it kind of kept on coming, like, how can we apply this in projects that have so little resources? Because, you know, reading the book, it goes in so much detail, and it clearly shows like the impact that it can have, but also it requests for a long time, a lot of commitment from the participants, you know, things that we might not be able to have during our MA. So I was a little bit like conflicted on how I could apply that into my project. And so here are just like some thoughts on how I was using that. And I think the first thing was to set some rules and mindsets that you mentioned on the book. So when people kind of join the workshop, we kind of have the shared understanding that, you know, everyone's experiences are valid, that everyone there has things to share with people or things to learn, and also that we are valuing assets. So we are looking at things that we have already and then we can build upon. I was also like trying to manage expectations and, you know, make sure that people understood that I wasn't gonna solve a big problem, but I was probably gonna try and, you know, give a step forward towards something that we wanted as a collective. So yeah, I thought that was very important. And then the other thing that she mentions is like bringing different people with different power to the table, and different power and different experiences. And in that sense, like, I think it was very productive, although in this specific case of my project, there's a little bit of an overlap about the professionals and people with lived experience. For example, one of these ladies, Kate, this woman here, she has a lot of influence in the neighborhood because she's the chair of the Beauvoir Association, but at the same time, she's a resident. Paul, which is this man, he's the building manager of this building that sits in the neighborhood and that used to be the community center, but now it's run by a private company. So he works for them, and he was also there. But things were kind of it's a bit merged. Who are people with lived experience and who are the professionals? But I thought it was really interesting to see how they engaged, and how Kate left this meeting with a paper full of notes on how she could improve things that the Beauvoir Association is doing. So yeah, I think for me that was really interesting to see how putting people with different kind of ways to participate in the community was very productive. And then and that was like a big failure because the book is called Beyond Sticky Notes, but somehow I ended up like doing a workshop that for a good part of it we were relying on sticky notes. And I think the problem that she mentioned is about, like, for people to engage with sticky notes, you kind of need to be think very quickly, and thinking in kind of short words and statements, and that's good. Like, some people are fine to do that, and some people struggle more. And I could see a little bit of this when I go back to the board and I see the handwritings. I can see that some people contributed a lot more, and I wonder if maybe that was the case. People I can see that had like struggles to write, only put a couple of post-its. So yeah, I actually, when I was reflecting on the workshop later, I was like, how did I do that? Like, the book's called Beyond Sticky Notes, and I ended up doing these sticky notes. But anyway, that's how we went. And I think kind of on the feedbacks, it was a lot about that, about like listening to other views and ideas, and understanding together problems and advantages that we have as a community. So I think, creating this space, it's like a very small step, I think, into bringing this idea that the design can kind of bring people together, that this type of discussion can be productive for the community. And then so that was the co-design workshop. And then I was trying to apply the matrix of needs to try and understand these kind of nodes that were put together. And I must say, I struggled a lot. We had already had a conversation last week about saying how difficult the matrix is, and how kind of sometimes things kind of might fall into all different categories. And that's a bit what started happening with me, because basically, like, what I had in this board is what we do well as a neighborhood, what we're failing at, and what do we desire. And I thought, okay, maybe let's look at what do we do well and map it on the matrix. And I just wasn't able to do it. Like, I started, but suddenly I was looking at like community events, and it kind of started going everywhere. And I realized, like, okay, is the community event satisfying what need? But are we talking about the people organizing the community events, or the people who are coming to it, or it's just a space that the community event allows you to go to? So yeah, I kind of stopped and then decided to look at one thing at a time. And that's kind of the image on the right. But again, I just thought I wasn't going anywhere. So I kind of stopped there. But I thought that was one thing that kind of came out that is interesting a bit, was that, that this being, having, doing, and interacting, I saw in a place translated as kind of the being the qualities of a place, and then the having is like the things that you have, so like norms, tools, or institutions, and the doing is the actions and the interacting more related to settings. So I think at that point, like, I kind of gave it a go and saw that I could at least organize some of these post-its within these categories, which was kind of an interesting thing to see, and compare, like, yeah, there was a lot more settings that we're failing at, the settings, for example, that we're doing well, for example, and there's no wonder that the outcome of this project, the outcome of the workshop were people wanting to have a space together. So they want to work on the settings more than on the things that we have, for example. I don't know. And so then I kind of, okay, so that was like the co-design part. And then I think the other thing that I'm seeing transition design coming into my project was a way to look at the how might we question, because I left the workshop and the result of it was that, like, we decided that what we really want as a community is to have a space to gather. We don't have a community center anymore. We're always doing like events outside, and which has issues with the weather. So people are like, they really want a space where they can be. And it's just I know it's a massive task. And I told them, like, I'm not going to have a space up and running in 2 months, but maybe, what is it that can be done towards that? And I was a bit stuck. And then I was kind of looking at my notes, and I saw that conversation that Cameron brought up about these paradoxes within service design, where you sometimes create like a dependency between the service provider and the receiver. And there was a different way of looking at this. So basically, I realized that on one side we have this kind of proactive and organized residents want a space for the community. On the other side, we have some very considerate private landlords, for example, Paul, who was there at the workshop, and who are really willing to expand their offerings to the community. And, that was kind of this relationship when I was looking at how might we, I didn't want to create a service that would just engage the landlords to give something to the residents. I wanted to think this way as a collaboration between the two. And that kind of, I came back to that question of kind of how might we help them to help us, which was something that Cameron mentioned. And that really stuck to me, because it is a thing that it goes both ways, and that it kind of also implies that the residents need to take action. They're not just going to be passively waiting for something to happen. And I think that was kind of the lesson that I kind of stuck to me, that is, these residents, they are an active entity. They're responsible for the service itself. They're not just kind of passive. And just to finish, I think kind of this relates back to a very initial conversation that I was having at the very beginning of my project, and looking at kind of different paradigms on public service delivery, and how, like, the kind of the receiver or the user was always seen as this passive entity, when actually there is this community paradigm which is being explored by some people, and which I'm very interested in, which is kind of looking at how we shift the power. So, the communities actually take over and they take control, but with that it comes this sense of responsibility. So yeah, that's where I am.
Thank you. I'll just get a slightly awkward thing out of the way, which is KA is now KA and KA is a they now. So and I say that also because KA happens to be KA Mercurtia happens to be in London right now. So you might run into them, and it would be important to pronoun as KA wishes to be pronounced these days. So just drawing your attention to that.
What is KA?
So Kellyanne's no longer Kellyanne. Kellyanne's kind of their dead name. So KA is now KA Mercurtia and goes by they, them. And so just in case you run into KA. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's always one of those tricky things. It's kind of nice to kind of have the difficulty as you kind of work through it, but particularly because KA published the book under Kellyanne. So, and isn't militant about it. So don't feel like it's awkward or anything, but just I've taught with KA and that's their desire. And so, just sharing that with you. I think I'm not entirely sure what you think you will lead to with this. So I'd just like to offer you what I was kind of hearing, which is you've undertaken a series of experiments with a community to see how the community might be activated more than they are already. So it's a community that has particular qualities, which is that there is some activation, and it's not activation of all, but it's definitely more than a lot of communities where the social capital is totally been ripped out. And so there are community groups and community organizations, and there is some activation of underutilized resources and things like that. But obviously your feeling is, particularly in the way the project's named, it's not as much as it could be. And it's not going somewhere else. And you don't want to say, hey, why aren't we a transition town? Why aren't we decarbonising? Or why aren't we a safe refuge? You know, you're not bringing a project to them, but you're interested for them to kind of, if I'm hearing right, you're interested for them to use what connectivity they do have to be doing more with that connectivity. So if I understand correctly, that's what these experiments are. And I think there's a really interesting project here for service design, which you have named as how to begin. And so that quite nice piece that you did at the beginning, which was kind of the insight you got from KA, which is everybody's always talking about once you've effectively assembled everybody and got them in a room, design starts. And you're looking at the service design before you get to service design, which is to get people in the room, to sensitize them to being in the room in the right way, and then to give them some things to do in the room so that they can begin to find their questions. So it could be called a kind of meta question, or it's a kind of prior question. I think it's a really interesting one, and it's one that I think most service design just thinks about recruitment or just thinks about something like that, and then it starts. And you're trying to look at these lighter touch services, systems, processes, practices that would help people get started, and then start to kind of ask the questions: what do we have? What do we do well? What do we need? How might we begin to kind of work in this way? And then your nice one at the end, which is how might we work collaboratively rather than kind of how might we get help or how might we help someone else. The one thing that occurred to me from a transition point of view is that, and I only was thinking about this yesterday when talking to Marla's group about the refugee transition. Transition designers always are doing two things. They're always responding to a problem, and then they're trying to enable a transition. So they're always working twice as hard as any other designer who can just go in and say, oh, here's a community that needs activation. I'm going to use some service design techniques, and then they're going to be activated and I can go away again. So transition design is always like, well, how is this also enabling system change? And so the one thing that occurred to me while you were speaking was that people often talk about the kind of workshops you've been doing as capacity building. And the service designer will have techniques taken from KA's book or taken from somewhere else, and they bring those techniques, and then people's capabilities are lifted. But it struck me that what you're also doing is, particularly in the way you described the way the community leader responded to the workshop, you're actually teaching them how to run their own workshops. And so you're not just capacity building, you're not just having tools which build their capacities and then they go off and do something different. In addition, you're giving them the toolbox. So they might come up with some stuff because of your workshops. Mm-hmm. They might come up with that, and then they might think, okay, well, that worked. Let's do it again. How did we do it? Well, Marina left us these things. This is how we start again. And so it's a kind of a toolkit for raising their autonomy to begin to sort of create their own capacity to do this. And so it seemed to me that that's what I wanted to sort of offer. That's what I was hearing that you were kind of doing. You're trying out things, and you don't want to just know if they work. You want to know if they're the sort of things that they could do on their own once you're not there, whether these could be techniques that they could take up. And that would be a transition. You would have transitioned them and given them more capacity, not by effectively having activated some new underutilized space, but actually by giving them these techniques itself. So I don't know how that chimes with you. I don't know if that fits.
Yeah, well, I think that would be like amazing if actually I had this impact on the people here. But yeah, it's interesting because when I started just with the interviews, even, just talking to people and telling them, some people didn't know about events happening or how to access this knowledge, and I started feeling that I was almost being the service myself. And this kind of meta thing about, is the design process, could that be the service? In some cases, it feels like that they're kind of merged together at points. And that the problem and that this output is just an excuse for the design process to happen, and it doesn't really matter what comes out, it's just what matters what's in the middle. The whole thing about the journey.
No, but so for example, there was this beautiful little project that Ezio Manzini and Francois Yagoud did a while ago called Lola, Looking for Likely Alternatives, LOLA. And it was a sort of card, and you would give it to elementary, primary school children, and you would say, go and find skills that people have. And they would just go knocking on the neighbourhood. Go and find needs people have, not in the Max Neef sense, but just like problems they have, things they wish were happening. And then finally, go find underutilized resources in the community. And then as a result of that, you could then put those three things together. Well, here's a need, here's somebody with some skills, and here's a resource. Let's put it together. But the real merit of the project was that a bunch of kids got to know all these people in their neighborhood. All the people in the neighborhood got to know each other because these kids are wandering around. It just totally shifted the relational dynamic of the project. And I think that's the kind of thing that you're doing and the kind of responses you're getting to those workshops. Yeah. The only other quick things I just mentioned, I don't know if you've had a look at Ezio's work at all. So Design When Everybody Designs has some nice little 2x2s around weak ties and different levels of social capital, and just it has these quite little nice frameworks for just kind of analyzing. The way you were talking was making me think about you sort of were struggling a little bit to get them or to make it work with the Max Neef needs. But I was thinking it was also, you were sort of saying, what do we do badly, or what would we desire? These are all interestingly phrased questions. What do you need? What do you desire? What are you doing badly? What are you doing well? What's a problem as opposed to a need? What's an opportunity that isn't like it's a problem that we haven't activated that opportunity. It's like an opportunity cost in economics. So I was just thinking about all these little things, and I almost think what you are discovering are different switches for doing transitions in a community, different ways of framing things, and not just accepting the standard human-centered design toolkit for how to do social activation and things like that. So yeah, these were all just little things that I was thinking. The only last thing I'd say is I was definitely wondering about who wasn't in the room.
Yeah.
And like non-users and all those people. And obviously, running out of time and things like that, but just trying to make sure that you are, again, that's that question of how do you start? Like, you have to start with who comes, but you have to always be aware of who's not there. And how do you make who's not there present in the room? Like that would be an interesting experiment, is kind of personas that represented all the people who weren't there. It's kind of rude and it would be politically incorrect, but on the other hand, it just kind of says, remember, this isn't the community. And that made me also just think that, all these places these days, particularly it's an issue with cosmopolitan localism. You don't want a totally autonomous transition town, because then it votes for Brexit. It's kind of xenophobic in parochial and that kind of way. You have to recognise that everywhere is a place, but also because it's always still got things coming in and out. So it's kind of interesting. It would be interesting to me to kind of audit what comes in and out. Obviously, tons of food and waste goes out, but people like short-term renters, and just kind of recognising that the place also has its neighbours, its boundaries, the next postal code, things like that. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see you talk about that so much, except with the maps at the beginning. But it would be interesting just to kind of say, you definitely have to have a place, but you definitely also need to always treat the border as permeable. You have to think about pluriverse as multiple places in the one place, that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina, and thank you very much, Cameron. This was really, really interesting and insightful. And I think now we can move on to Aya's presentation, which I'm really looking forward to, despite what my message seemed to suggest.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, hi everyone. First of all, I apologize if you feel uncomfortable to listen to my voice because I caught a cold. So yeah, sorry. And okay, I'm gonna explain about my project. My project is Transition to Circular Fashion Waste Behavior, learning from our Tokyo circular city, Edo culture, to support Tokyo residents' transition for circular attitude. And before explaining about my question, I'd like to mention about Edo. Edo is an old Tokyo city around 300 years ago. The population was largest in the world at the time. And by the way, London was the second at the time. And despite the population, Tokyo City had a circular waste system, but now the culture was disappeared. And moreover, according to some surveys, Japanese people is one of the low conscious countries about sustainability. So my question is, how might we co-design a transition of Tokyo residents' fashion disposal behaviors toward more circular behaviors by learning from the city's history, Edo? In the first session, I was impressive for this sentence was impressive for me. Stop talking about the future. Instead, talk about preferable system. This is from Cameron in the other kickoff session. So I kept this sentence in my mind during my project. And now, after doing some activities, I learned, of course, stop talking about future, instead talk about preferable system is important. And talking about preferable system cannot be done at once. This is what I learned from previous activities. And this is my context. I like to explain from visioning preferable future for coming prototyping step. And I co-designed with 17 Tokyo metropolitan residents. And I did 2 in-person workshops for envisioning a preferable system for circular fashion waste. And go through these 2 workshops was to get a vision for the service concept of the next prototype step. So I like to explain about the first session. It was on the 27th August last month in Tokyo. And first of all, I tried to get co-designer to imagine a future circular fashion world in 2050 using domains of everyday life, which is by Gideon Koshoff. And this template from a transition design seminar at Carnegie Mellon University. In this workshop, some participants kept imagining futures with a lot of magical technology. For example, clothes will be washed or mended in the future using photosynthesizing technology. So this vision sounds so exciting and attractive, but if the timeline of the vision is just 30 years, it sounds so require more technological development. And one reason I choose this template is because I wanted to talk about preferable system, not imaginary futures. So it would be easy to imagine the preferable vision and system by dividing domains like this. But however, participants seem to have difficulty imagining the system. They feel difficulty filling in each section and connecting the relationship with each sticky notes. Initially, I wanted to ask participants put sticky notes on each section, and I wanted to ask them to connect each sticky notes, but they couldn't do it like this. For example, in the left side example, in the city and region section were blank. So yeah, they feel difficulty, and I felt challenged. To imagine a preferable future system with workshop participants. However, I could understand what scenario is preferable for participants in this workshop at least. So I conducted the second workshop last week. And this activity is for co-designers to imagine preferable system in a different way. And here's how I did it. One split participant into 2 groups to work on this map. And this map, again, referred to transition design seminar at Carnegie Mellon University. And I edited it a bit for my project. And in this map, x-axis is domains of everyday life again. And in y-axis is deep analysis categories. And each sticky note shows initiative or services in the future. And each color of sticky notes shows a timeline. For example, in yellow one is in 5 years. For example, the light green one is in 15 years, and the green one is in 30 years. Yes, emoji shows which stakeholders are involved in the services. And finally, regarding the labels below each sticky notes, I try to apply what kind of outcome or value could accept expect for each project. And before explaining about each steps, I made one vision scenario, which is the left-handed one. And I made 5 years, 15 years, 30 years milestone, which is blue bubble in the light. And to achieve this vision scenario based on previous workshop. So I made this right after, I made preferable vision scenario just after the first workshop. Then before the second workshop, I made backcasting thing. So the first step is pick up concept from backcasting that could become services or initiatives. Yeah. There's 3 scenarios, so I ask participants pick up some key concept or keyword as much as they can. Then step 2, convert each concept into a service or initiative and describe on sticky notes and place it on a matrix. At the same time, I ask participants to change colors depends on timeline and place at least one services or initiative in each row and column. But honestly, some participants said this conversion step was a bit difficult. Then step 3, tag emergent outcome or value for each project. These emergent outcomes are core values that we want to achieve in the system. These 3, which is in the section of emergent outcomes, came from the previous activities. And I realized they relate to synergic satisfiers of max-need needs. I tried to ensure that all services on this map satisfied needs using these color labels. But honestly, I'm still not sure this function worked well. So I'm digesting this part by myself now. Then step 4, put relevant stakeholders emoji on sticky notes. So for example, this service related to fashion brands, participant will put clothes emoji on it. And it's not necessarily put it on every sticky note, but ensure that all stakeholders are included on the map at least once. Then this is the most important step. Connect the impact of service or initiative on each service or initiative. Connect the impact of service initiative on other service or initiative with positive conflict lines. Also describe any potential risk that are caused by other services or initiatives. So the main aim of this activity is to create a system that can build as a preferable relationship as possible in this world building. Then this is the final step. Recombine, remove, and add project initiatives as much as possible to reduce conflict relationship. I told participants iteration process is more important than perfection. Then finally, they managed to make these systems. And I think this works better than before workshop because participants could imagine what happened in multiple layers and sections, and they could conscious of the impact and relationship of each initiative. Of course, I don't think these works well for all cases, but what I learned or kept in my mind when I co-designed the preferable system as R regarding preparation. I think it's need to do multiple sessions for visioning. First, we discuss preferable situation among participants, and designer made this discussion into one scenario. Then we can think about systems. So when co-designing preferable system with participants, I realized it's challenging to do both at once. And in terms of and in terms of sharing vision, in which a designer merges and or digest participants' point of view from previous activities will help to co-design for preferable system. So in terms of workshop, two things. One, I learned important to encourage participants to be conscious of what impact one service initiative causes. Second thing is encourage participants to think about stakeholders who have different point of views. And in the end of the workshop, the second workshop, I asked participants to vote the most favorite service or initiative in the map. So based on the popular idea, I asked them to vote by yellow heart. We are planning to prototype with Tokyo residents tomorrow night. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So the first thing is you must really show some of this work to Terry at some point. I think it's just making me, I don't know if Terry has this experience, if Terry teaches transition design at Carnegie Mellon, whether the students kind of faithfully do the templates and tools because Terry's right there, or whether they have difficulties and then begin innovating and changing and trying them. I think they do the latter. But you've done that. You've done some really interesting modifications to the process to make it work for you. And I think the way the kind of the visual communication that you've done, where you've layered scale and sectors of society, environment, the way you've kind of ideated using that template, but then given them time layer, but with the colors of the post-it notes, I think is really clever and interesting. It's a really interesting way of kind of presenting that. So there's some really interesting innovations in the way you've done this work. And so you have to kind of package that up and tell it to Terry, because I think she uses those templates more than I do. And she would be really interested to see you doing that.
Thank you so much.
So a couple of things that just occurred to me, just starting with your observation that the preferable is difficult to do. So to some extent, futuring is easier because people have got something to start with, which is now, and then they can just extrapolate and it either gets better or worse. But if you just say to somebody, come up with something preferable, people will struggle. It just occurred to me that I hadn't explained this, or it occurred to me, you caused me to realize that the Max Neef framework is a way of focusing the question, make it preferable. So it's kind of like, you're dealing with something here that's in protection. Can you also make it more creative? So it would be preferable and creative. You're dealing with something here which is subsistence. Can you add idleness? So you deliberately kind of focus the preferential by synergically adding something to it. And it just occurred to me that, yes, the preferable in the abstract is hard, but using a Max Neef framework can help people start to do that. So that was one thing that occurred to me. The other thing that occurred to me is that, again, goes to the same point that transition design is never just trying to solve one issue. And it's a bit in that synergic example. But if you're focusing on clothing, it's really hard to just say to people, let's just come up with a more sustainable, preferable, circular clothing system. Sorry, the dogs have come back for a walk and just came running in. Transition design is always also about system change. And so what you might do in order to help people think about preferable is say, imagine a clothing system that also goes with a more equitable society. Imagine a clothing system that goes with a society which is totally borderless and open to refugees. Imagine a clothing system in which, so the stupid idea that came to me was kind of like everybody's living more communally. And it's a commune, it's a large building now that's also functioning as a commune, and everybody's getting on famously. It's like the great late 19th century utopian bohemian existence. So of course everybody would be borrowing everybody else's clothes. So what you do is you say, imagine clothing in a bohemian collective. Imagine clothing in a hyper localist community. Imagine clothing in a society without cash or something.
Yeah,
And
actually,
sorry, go.
Sorry. Actually, during the workshop, there's an idea about creating circular point, which is not money, and so participants' conversation, how to say, is not only focusing on clothes, but they really think about how to create circular community. It was like our conversation.
Okay, great. So that's an example exactly where the preferential comes from thinking about systemic change in addition to change to the thing that's the focus of the workshop, which might be clothing. So it sounds like that conversation was naturally kind of happening as people tried to negotiate that preference. Just one other thing on that, which is the bit that I still can't see in your project. One of the reasons why you might say don't future, just think about preferable, is precisely to activate the past as an example of preferable. Like in a very Western way, we think it's all about progress and there can't be anything good back there, so forget about that. Gideon is very insistent that there are lots of examples of ways of living in the past, which may continue with certain populations living in particular ways. There are lots of examples of that, and they can be the source of the preferable. So if there was a circular fashion system in Edo, period, like that should be the starting point. That's preferable. So this is almost the question for the workshop is, how do we become Edo again? So you use the past precisely because you're not thinking only about the future. And the other thing is to say that the preferable might also just be other places. How do they live currently in Shenzhen? How do they live in Nairobi? How do they live, an indigenous Maori community in Aotearoa, New Zealand? How do they live there? So you can find these without appropriating indigenous people. You can find these preferables. The last thing, I'll just chuck it in the chat, is that there actually was a project. I thought I had the link here, just find it. There was a project that, again, Ezio Manzini did, and it was a large EU-funded project, and it was called SUS House, Sustainable House. And they got together multi-stakeholder groups for different aspects of life, clothing, care, food, transport. I can't remember all of them. And they got industry and sustainability experts. It was like in 2003 they did this project. It was 20 years ago. And they said, imagine a more sustainable clothing system. And then they had sustainability experts who evaluated the scenario. And then they said, right, this is the scenario. This is, of all the scenarios you came up with, this is the most sustainable. Now backcast. So if you just have a look at that article there, that is just an article I found on the clothing backcast. But it's just a useful precedent that you might not have come across. And it just occurred to me that, they had this very nice poster at one point, which is this idea that all clothing is a clothing library. And so it was kind of like the advantage is you get infinite fashion. You can change your fashion. Every week you take your dirty clothes back, but the laundromat, the laundry is in fact a clothing library. So you give them dirty clothes and they give you a week's new wardrobe. So every week you have a new wardrobe. So the idea was it was this amazing fashion variety from a clothing library. And they just had this very nice little poster that captured it in really bad 2004 graphics.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read the article.
Okay, yeah, have a look. There's other stuff around the sus house, but yes, be careful when you do. But put in Manzini and it'll probably come up. It'll make your search safe. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Can I just say one other quick thing just about, don't tell Gideon I said this, right? Bad that we're recording it. But I sometimes think the problem with the scales of everyday life one, which you found was difficult for the workshop participants. So, kind of village and city and state and nation. One of the difficulties of that map is actually the way it's being visualized. It doesn't, obviously at the state, it's not just the state, it's many cities. And when you can start to think, oh, there's this city and this city and this city, and at the state level, they're interacting. I get materials from here, I send it here, these people are working here. So it shouldn't be drawn with just like point scale. It needs to be kind of point, a few points, many points in that way, just to help people think, not just at a bigger governance scale, but at a kind of multi-local collaboration, cosmopolitan localism. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
thank you, Aya, and thank you, Cameron, for this. And now for the last presentation for today, which will be from Anirudh.
Great. Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen.
I can see.
I don't know how much justice I'm doing to transition design, but it's just my attempt at whatever I have understood over the last few weeks. So just to give you a brief context about my project, it's about creating a circular service around toys, just to sort of shift the mindsets from linear consumption to more like ownership of, like shifting from ownership of toys to more like access to play. So how can we provide young families to access to play? That's like the main focus of my project, and build circularity around toys. So what I have been up to so far is I've done a lot of ethnographic studies in terms of studying and mapping the present circular behaviors in the community level. So for example, if people are doing like garage sales or just donating toys, and then I have been part of a Toy Swap event organized by one of the local MPs. That was a very good experience for me just to see if people are interested in such events. And then I was also a part of a toy repair workshop organized by the Young VNA Museum. Again, so these workshops and these events are just like once upon a time sort of an event. It doesn't happen regularly. Which is the kind of problem that is there at the community level, that these are events which people really love to go, but then they are not easily found in the community level. I also got the opportunity to conduct sort of a visioning workshop with school children, which was my early sort of experience into transition design, about how can we sort of create alternate sort of preferable futures. And that workshop was with school children for their local area, which is Dulwich in London. So it was about upcycling and building those sort of circular mindsets in the children. And that was a very good experience for me as well. From my learnings of your talk on like the Max-Neef matrix, I sort of tried to understand it and tried to adapt it around the life cycle journey of toys, just to see how does it sort of like what sort of needs are there in toy consumption. So on the basis of all the interviews I have had with parents, about 24 parents that I interviewed, I sort of categorized different activities according to the life cycle of the toys, right from acquisitions, which like selecting and buying the toys, to sort of the unboxing experience, to the interaction stage where they are like playing, to the sort of transition and farewell, and even like the nostalgia later on when kids sort of grow up and then they no longer have those toys, and even adults remembering their childhood and the joy they had from playing with their toys, and the kind of needs that parents have and the kind of needs that children also have related to toys. And I could see a lot of overlap in those needs. Just to sort of give an example of the few core needs that I identified, which are like really prominent in toy consumption. And it's like almost all the needs, but yeah, few major ones are like definitely sustenance, protection, affection, um, participation. But then, yeah, like how can I sort of align it is basically in terms of sustenance, it's about ensuring that families get access to toys. Um, and in participation, I see this as more like from a sort of service design perspective about how can I involve parents and children at the community level to implement this service, because while we are waiting for a big transition to happen at the policy level, it probably might take around 20 years. But what can we do right now at the community level is kind of the focus of my project. Um, and then again, like basically leisure, about how can basically the idea of sustainable play, how can that be enjoyable and fulfilling? Because like if we can give a second life to toys, and that can be a very good thing. Um, yep. And then like from what you were saying about the sort of finding synergies and like how some needs can be disruptive and how some needs can sort of help and like help in sort of aligning with other needs. So for example, for me, like if I talk about sustenance, it's about providing that sort of accessibility and affordability. But then again, the other need, which is freedom, which is the choice to play sustainably, both of these needs, if I just focus on one of them, they can be disruptive against one another. So how can I sort of balance both these needs would be a very interesting thing for me. So that's what I learned from this activity. And I realized that this service that I am designing needs to sort of offer a holistic well-being for families and children. And like it can touch upon a lot more than just like sustainable play. So it can like really have a like holistic outcome. Um, when I'm sort of trying to understand the apply transition design like frameworks, um, I sort of try to understand it from the current system that I have mapped right now, based on all the stakeholders I have. So like for example, toys can be passed on via referral service. Then again, that has different outlets. It can be given to children in need in hospitals. And then one interesting service that one of the stakeholders that I am currently working with, so they have like a prison service where they sort of send toys to the homes of inmates on just to be like on behalf of the inmates, just to be able to sort of provide toys to the children whose parents on special occasions like birthdays and Christmas. Um, but then again, like after the use, then toys are basically donated back to charities or toy libraries. Toy libraries, there aren't very few, like there aren't a lot of them. Very few of them exist. But then that's the direction that sort of I want to delve deeper into. But then again, so if toys are not sort of passed on and like if they are thrown, then they basically end up being sort of taken by the local councils and like if they can be recycled, they are recycled, which is very less in terms of toys because even in the UK, toys go in the general waste. They are really difficult to recycle. But then there has been some sort of efforts to recycle toys, but most of it basically it ends up as waste. And when we sort of so this sort of system helped me understand the kind of wicked problems that are there in this current system of toys, from unsustainable production to the effects of consumerism, and there is this disposable culture. It's a very similar approach to fast fashion, and again like the kind of environmental impact it has. So all these problems are sort of interlinked, and like if I try to sort of think it from a transition design perspective, it's about how can all these like how can we look across these interconnections and design something that sort of helped me to understand how these problems evolved from the past. Just like effects like over commercialization or things like excessive packaging. Like there are some toys which have a shorter lifespan than the lifespan of the packaging. So it's like the toy might get broken, or like the toy might just get, the children might just lose interest in the toy, but then the packaging will like leave for like, I don't know, like 15-20 years more than the toy probably. Then obviously like, so understanding the sort of interconnections was again very helpful to me. So right now where I am is basically my main project partner. It's called Waste Buster. And with them, we are currently doing a pilot program with Tesco's in the south of England, where there are like multiple Tesco stores right from East Sussex to West Sussex to Brighton, where people can just go and drop off their broken toys in these toy booths in set up in Tesco's, and then they can be sort of collected and recycled. We are also partnering with schools and sort of asking schools to take part in this initiative. It's called Recycle to Read. Basically, schools, when they are organizing such events like toy swap or toy sale events, they get like Planet Care points. Even if they're like, even if the students are depositing toys in these booths, they can get Toy Care Planet Care points, which can be redeemed for books. So that's the kind of pilot program that I'm currently testing with this organization. But then what I want to do in the future is like the kind of visioning workshop that Aya just presented. So like basically trying to do like a co-design workshop with stakeholders from this organization, from schools, even from local councils about what can be different ways of creating like circular alternatives, and how can we create excitement for circular toys in children, and basically also trying to see what other alternate models can be there, like business models, because for all these circular models need to be sort of self-sustainable. So that's another aspect that I'll be looking into about alternate business models. And yeah, so that's the kind of next step for me, this co-design workshop. Um, so based on all that learning, I also tried to apply it to the multi-level perspective, which I learned from like Terry and Cameron. Like Cameron also like briefly mentioned about it, I think previously. So it's about, yeah, like I can see that there this can also like like lead to a lot of sort of touch points, and I can identify the kind of, so for example, there is a consumer demand for sustainability, but at present, since the market is sort of, I can say it's basically dominated by a lot of these established toy manufacturers and toy brands. So there is a lot of resistance as well from them, in terms of like moving towards a circular sort of service. And how can we then sort of have a stakeholder relation where these toy brands don't see themselves as competitors with a toy library, for example. So that's the kind of aim that I have with my for like future workshops that are coming. Yep. That's all that I had to share.
Beautiful. Thank you. We're doing a project at the moment which is about sort of coming heat days, as you've just experienced. If you're in the UK over the summer, you know, I know it doesn't take much to freak out the British people about heat compared to Australia, but you did actually have a very hot summer, and we're about to have a terrible one down here. And so we've been doing work with social housing, people in social housing, and the ways in which they cope with the heat. And the favourite example of my colleague, Abby Melek-Lopez, is a sort of truck that the local council drives around, and they drive to a park and then they park it under a tree, and like chitty chitty chip bang bang, the kids come running, and then they're all just sitting in the shade of the tree. And so it's an interesting example because it's toys, but she's reading it entirely in terms of thermal climate change adaptation. And again, it's a bit the theme of the conversation that I'm starting to learn from you all doing these presentations, is that one of the things about transition design is always doing two things: solving some kind of particular situation and trying to enable a pathway. And one of the ways to do that is to keep switching means and end. So if you're kind of thinking, I need people to share so that there is sustainable toys, then the transition is, if I get people to share toys, I'm making a sharing society. So your means for your end, which is toys, you suddenly make toys the means for the end, which is transition. And you know, that's what's kind of happening when you're talking about the way toys also obviously do something for parents. So when middle class parents take their children to this park and kids are playing with broken old bashed up toys that come out the back of a truck, same toys every Sunday, and are more excited about that than whatever they just got given brand new last week. It's just another thing that's causing the parents to think maybe we should get off this consumerist treadmill. So that's where, so I just think always maintain that. I mean, obviously with the partners you're working with that you mentioned at the end, it's people really focused on toy waste, plastic waste, and circular economy. It's very difficult to say to those people, I'm just using you as a means to do a bigger transition. But I think as a project, as you're doing this in a master's project, just always be thinking about which way the causality is kind of going. So that was just my first kind of comment. In that, I think it's important to, so often when people do projects around toys, it's a good example, microcosm of capitalism, in that kids are just these terrible little, you know, sequential consumers. Like you give them a toy and they play for it a week and then they forget, where's my next toy? Where's my next toy? So I think a lot of people choose to focus on toys because they're kind of emblematic of a wider adult problem. But I think that sometimes causes us to forget some of the Max Nefian aspects of toys as to why they are also unsustainable, perhaps a little bit necessarily, in which case you can sort of ask, is there such a big problem here? But you know, toys in Western culture are, for better or worse, mostly for worse, closely tied to gift giving and presents and the idea of getting something new and unwrapping and seeing. Like and that newness and that novelty, you know, that's a really important part of toys, at least culturally, in the way they've kind of become the landscape, the regime, is that they have that element. And it is always the thing that has to be traded off the moment you try to do any kind of circular toys or circulating of toys, unless you've got a really top-notch remanufacturing, people who can make the toy look as good as new between uses. In that, so you have a whole service industry, in which case it probably loses its unsustainability. So definitely what needs to be transitioned is something around that. And I just raised one other one, which I mentioned before, but I think it's also really important. I remember when I was doing work on the sharing economy back before it was called the sharing economy. So in the old days of product service systems and decoupling use and ownership, the big issue was kind of, you don't need to own something to use something. So there were all these silly functional equivalents which actually don't work. You don't want a washing machine, you want clean clothes. You don't want a car, you want mobility. It's a classic sort of, I think, mistaken logic. But it sort of also misses that we learn property through having toys as kids. The very first social interactions humans ever have in many westernized societies is a kid fighting with another kid over possession of a toy. Like that's almost like the first, it's parallel play and then it's war. Like that's how humans socialize. And so you suddenly realize that, sorry, I'm really grandstanding here, but a toy is crucial to this kind of property and extended sense of self. Like the toy is the first thing that somebody says, this is yours. So you both get a sense of subjectivity at the moment you're given an object. And I just think it's one of the things to say, we're not trying to get rid of all toys or all gifts. You're still going to get a present at Christmas and on your birthday, and it's going to be for you. You know, classic anthropology, a gift is an inalienable possession. It's given to you. You own a gift more than you own anything you ever bought. Like it's actually, the gift giving is somebody saying, this is wholly yours. That's a curse as well, by the way, because you can't get rid of it. You can never just say, thanks, I'm going to put it in the bin now. You're not allowed to do that. You're definitely not allowed to give it to somebody else. Although in some cultures, obviously, gift giving, you're supposed to do that. Anyway, I just think that's another one of these means ends. Like, how do you deal that it's not all toys enable property and gifts, but it's all the other toys. It's not surplus toys. It's sufficient toys. It's something like that. So I just give you those as some framings.
Another thing that I'm doing actually is basically, you might know this, that most toys, they are just being sold until their license period is there.
Yep.
And once the license period is over, manufacturers either have to stop like selling it or basically destroy the entire batch. Big brands still do that, like below the radar, just because they want to protect the brand image. So there is this sort of thing that a lot of these toys which are like unlicensed now, which like license period is over, they would just be destroyed. But how can we sort of rehome those toys? But then there are like charity stores like the Salvation Army, for example, which is like, yeah, give the whole lot to us and then we'll sell it off. But then that's like not the best use of those sort of toys. So another aspect is what is the criteria for rehoming such toys?
Yeah. So that's the last comment I wanted to make, which is, as you were talking, I was remembering this article I just saw the other day. I don't know if I mentioned this last week. It was a remarkable article about a lumber yard in Melbourne. So there happens to be a sort of a timber sawmill in the middle of urban Melbourne. And instead of getting rid of it and replacing it with apartments, they're actually running it as a mill. And very typical of this city, Melbourne, it's become this kind of gift economy. And what they do is they say, if you're going to chop down a tree, a big mature tree in your own property or a street tree, you have to, before you chop it down, know what the wood is going to become. We're not going to chip any part of the tree. You have to create basically what they call a chain of custody, which is, okay, we've got these people here, they want a table, a kitchen table and some chairs, and this tree is going to become that. They've signed up, they've agreed to it. There's no money. It's just purely like this custodianship. Then they say, right, okay, now you can chop down the tree and bring it to us and we'll mill it, we'll saw it. So anyway, I'll send you the story. It's a really, like, it's a just crazy, amazing kind of experiment. And then I just got my wife to get this for me in the background. I don't know if you saw. So this is a puzzle that we just did, a New Yorker puzzle. It's not a particularly difficult puzzle. And then my daughter noticed this on the side. So it says notes, name, notes, right? So they've kind of designed it to hand on the puzzle. And the notes is, you write here and you say, we've lost the piece in the top corner, sorry, and hand it on, right? But so what's interesting about this little thing is that it's turning the provenance of the circular economy. Normally when people talk about circulating things, you have to erase the previous use. I don't want it, like, it needs to look as good as new. It needs to look new. I don't want to know. This is kind of like, no, every kid gets, it's like Toy Story, the Pixar films. Every kid gets the toy, and the toy contains information about all the previous kids. And you obviously can't see the kids, but you can kind of see the home they used to live in. You can see the kind of activities they used to do. Bruce Sterling once called these spimes. A spime is when you attach information to a product, and it can accumulate over time. So you could do this easily with the Internet of Things, but it kind of means that you are transitioning us to think that there is value in legacy and handing on, in knowing prior stories. You're kind of giving back to Western consumerism a sense of elders and ancestors. I mean, I've no idea who my great-grandparents were. I don't know where they lived, I don't know what their names are. You know, I'm a Westerner without ancestors. But weirdly, I could kind of have a puzzle and realize it's gone through people who aren't related to me, but suddenly I have ancestors. So I just think these are kind of interesting transitions. And if you're thinking not just about the system of handing over the toys, but some sort of recoding of some of the toys so that they have that. And obviously you'd have to design them so that they could be repairable and carry the spine. So yeah, I don't know if that fits at all.
Yeah, definitely. That's very helpful.
Yeah, but always like the transition design is to add the other thing to the project that you're working on that would be a societal transition,
definitely.
Shifting people out of property or changing. And obviously, yeah, the task is not to take all the toys away from the kids.
Yeah.
Or just redistribute the toys that are unlicensed to the kids who don't have enough money to buy them, but instead do that in a way that's also a transition. Just one last comment which occurred to me. Again, I'll have to think about this, and I'd be interested to know if anyone has it. I thought I heard you talk about the fact that you can't only synergize needs. That it's the first time I'd ever thought of it. It's kind of an obvious point, but the first time I'd ever thought about it. There's always also going to be trade-offs. They don't have to be violators or inhibitors, but there will be trade-offs. You can get several, you can't get them all.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like you can get a great toy. It's just not going to have the newness, that weird shininess that highly manufactured plasticized toys have. which they only have for like 30 seconds, and then
Yeah, audio unboxing experience.
yeah. I remember someone saying that, you know, if you mapped the life cycle of plastic, I'll see if I can draw it in the air. The weird thing about plastic is you get it and it looks brand spanking new, but then weirdly you don't notice it. It's literally like it kind of oxidizes. And then overnight it is how it is forever. It's unchanging. You can never tell a 5-year-old plastic from a 5-month-old plastic. It has no aging. It's just perfect. It's definitely not new, but it's definitely just who knows how old. And then all of a sudden just disintegrates. Like just, it doesn't age. Just overnight there'll be white pressure stresses in the plastic, and the next day it's just a fragments. You know, it's like a red bucket in your backyard. It just suddenly. So plastics don't conform to any sense we have of the way materials age. That like leather or wood, or, you know, you can always kind of look at these things and kind of think, oh yeah, I can tell how old it is. Plastic, you have no idea. And you never know if tomorrow's the day they're all just going to, the links between the polymers are going to oxidize and fall apart. It's a metaphor for life. You know?
I remember during my interview for my physics degree, I basically got in because in my interview I bashed chemistry as fundamentally malevolent, based on very much a simple argument. This is kind of all the time we have today. And kind of unintentionally, all 3 projects were very much about kind of the community interactions with things, with kind of an interesting, as I mentioned, the talk about how means and ends kind of swap places at perfect times. Cameron, would you have any closing remarks before we close off the session?
No, it's just so fun. Honestly, it's both fun and I love seeing work, and you're all doing so much work, and I know it's a really horrible period in the middle when things are a mess, and you've done some experiments that work and some haven't. But as I say, I'm just sitting here writing down things, thinking I never thought about. I don't think about these things unless. So it's such a gift to get back to see these things as you work through them. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much. So next week we're going to have a very similar session with 3 projects, hopefully. And then we're going to go on a bit of a hiatus as we finish our major projects and may reunite for another session in December when we will have a more complete set of things to talk about. Thank you everyone who presented their projects, and thank you of course to Cameron. We will now close off the session and reunite here in 15 minutes for a debrief as always. Thank you also very, very much.
Thanks everyone. See you next week.
Bye, thank you.